The receiving chamber of Queen Seris was designed to make visitors feel insignificant. Vaulted ceilings that disappeared into shadow, crystalline pillars that caught light in ways that made spatial relationships impossible to judge. And at the far end, elevated on a throne that seemed to grow organically from the floor, sat the queen herself, tall, elegant, with the long, expressive ears that marked Valthari royalty and eyes that held the weight of centuries. Captain Daniel Reed stood in the center of the chamber, acutely aware that he was representing humanity despite having exactly zero diplomatic training. He was here because he was the only option, the sole survivor of a catastrophic accident that had destroyed the rest of his task force, the only human within 3 weeks' travel of Valthari space. Not exactly the ideal first contact scenario. The formal part of the meeting had proceeded as Daniel expected. Introductions through the protocol officer, careful diplomatic language about humanity's intentions in this sector, questions about territorial boundaries and trade possibilities. Daniel had answered honestly and carefully, explaining that human expansion was driven by exploration and resource needs, that they sought peaceful coexistence, that the accident which destroyed most of his task force was exactly that, an accident, not an attack or provocation. Queen Seris had listened with focused attention, her ears tilting in various positions that Daniel couldn't quite interpret. Her advisors had whispered among themselves, taking notes, asking occasional clarifying questions. Everything felt appropriately formal and carefully managed. Then the queen dismissed her advisors. The chamber emptied with surprising speed, leaving only Daniel, Queen Seris, and 2 silent guards stationed at the exits. The atmosphere shifted, from formal protocol to something Daniel couldn't identify but which made him deeply uneasy. Seris descended from her throne with fluid grace, approaching Daniel with an intensity that made him want to step back. But he held his ground, maintaining the respectful distance protocol required while fighting the instinct to retreat. When she finally spoke, her voice was different from the formal tone she'd used during the diplomatic session, less measured, more personal. "Captain Reed," she said, "I have a question that is not diplomatic or strategic. It is personal, and you may refuse to answer if it makes you uncomfortable." Daniel's mind raced. What could an alien queen possibly want to ask him that was personal? Was this some kind of test? A trap? "I'm listening, Your Majesty." Sarah studied him for a long moment, her ears cycling through several positions. When she spoke, her question was simple and devastating. "Are you alone, human?" The question hit Daniel like a physical blow because the answer was yes in ways that went far beyond his current isolation. He stood there, feeling exposed in ways that had nothing to do with being in a foreign court or representing his species. Seris waited, her expression patient but intense, clearly expecting an answer. Daniel took a breath and made a decision: honesty. If this was a test, he was too tired to navigate it with diplomatic evasion. If it was genuine curiosity, she deserved the truth. "Yes, Your Majesty," he said quietly. "I'm alone." Seris's ears tilted forward, sharp attention. Daniel had learned from his cultural briefings. She gestured to a seating area he hadn't noticed before, tucked into an alcove of the massive chamber. "Sit with me, Captain, please." It wasn't really a request, but her tone lacked the command weight of earlier formal exchanges. Daniel followed her to the alcove, settling into a seat that was clearly designed for Valthari proportions, but which adapted to his smaller human frame with disconcerting ease. "You said you're alone," Seris began, taking her own seat across from him. "I meant the question more specifically than you may have interpreted. Are you the only human in this region?" "Yes. My ship's crew died in the accident that brought me here. My task force was destroyed by cascade failure in our jump drives. I survived because I was off-ship during a survey mission. I'm the only human within 3 weeks' travel of this location." Daniel paused, then added the harder truth before he could stop himself. "But I was alone before that, too." Seris's expression shifted subtly. "Explain." My family died 5 years ago. Colony failure on Haven Station. My wife Alina and my daughter Maya were part of the evacuation that never made it out. Life support failed before rescue arrived. Daniel forced himself to meet her eyes despite the pain of speaking about it. I've been alone in the ways that matter for 5 years now. This current isolation is just more obvious. The silence that followed felt heavy with significance Daniel couldn't identify. Seris's ears moved through several positions, what he thought might be surprise, consideration, something else he couldn't name. "Why did you tell me that?" she asked finally, her voice quieter than before. "I asked about your current situation. You gave me your grief. Because you asked if I was alone, not just whether I was the only human here." That phrasing suggested you wanted the real answer, not just the tactical one. Daniel found himself unable to look away from her intense gaze. "And because I'm tired of pretending that isolation is just logistical. Everyone treats being alone like it's a temporary condition you power through, but sometimes it's just what is, and pretending otherwise feels dishonest." Seris was quiet for a long moment, her fingers steepled in what looked like deep thought. When she spoke again, her voice carried weight that went beyond her formal authority. "I asked because I recognized something in how you carried yourself during our formal session. You spoke for humanity, but you spoke as someone who has already lost everything they might fear losing. That kind of emotional clarity is rare. It usually comes from isolation, the kind that strips away the comfortable lies we tell ourselves about connection and belonging. Your Majesty, I don't understand why that matters to you." Seris's ears pressed back, vulnerability, Daniel realized with surprise. "Because I am alone too, Captain Reed. I am surrounded by advisors, court, thousands of people who exist in proximity to my power. But I have not had a genuine conversation with someone who sees me as a person rather than a position in." She paused. "I cannot remember how long. Centuries, perhaps." Daniel blinked, trying to process that an alien queen who commanded an empire was claiming to understand his isolation. "But you're surrounded by people. How can you be alone? Have you ever been in a room full of people and felt completely isolated because every single person there wanted something from you?" Seris asked. "Because every interaction was calculated around what you could provide, what favor they could earn, what political advantage they could gain. Because no one, not one person, simply wanted to know you as an individual rather than as a function." "No," Daniel admitted. "My isolation is different. It's from loss, not from being surrounded by people who can't see past what I represent." "Different causes, same result." Seris leaned forward slightly. "No one really sees you. They see the lone human representative, the captain who survived, the diplomatic necessity. Just as no one sees me. They see the queen, the decision-maker, the symbol of Valthari power. We are both alone, Captain Reed. I asked if you were alone because I suspected you might understand what that means in ways my own people cannot." Daniel sat with that for a moment, feeling the truth of it settle uncomfortably in his chest. "So you asked me a personal question to see if I'd be honest about something that made me vulnerable?" "Yes. I needed to know if you were someone who could talk about isolation without performing strength you don't feel, without hiding behind professional distance or diplomatic evasion." Seris's expression was more open than it had been during the entire formal session. "When you gave me your grief instead of just your tactical situation, I knew I'd found something rare. Someone capable of genuine honesty about pain. Why does that matter to you?" "Because I am desperately lonely, Captain Reed. And I thought perhaps someone who understood isolation might be willing to simply talk with me, not as queen and representative, but as two people who know what it means to be alone despite being surrounded by others." They talked for hours, not about diplomacy or territorial boundaries or trade agreements, about loneliness, about grief, about the different ways isolation manifested and the different strategies they'd each developed for surviving it. Seris explained what Daniel had never really understood about positions of absolute power, that they created fundamental distance from everyone around you, that every interaction became filtered through hierarchy and need, that even her closest advisors framed every conversation around her role and responsibilities rather than her as an individual. "I make decisions that affect billions of lives," she said. Her ears tilted in what Daniel was learning indicated melancholy. "I carry the weight of my empire's future. Every choice I make ripples through generations. But I cannot remember the last time someone asked me how I felt about anything, rather than what I've decided about everything. The isolation of power is absolute because everyone needs something from you, and no one simply wants to know you." Daniel found unexpected resonance in that despite his very different circumstances. "I'm alone because I've lost everyone I cared about. You're alone because you can never fully trust that anyone cares about you rather than what you represent. Different causes, same result. No one really sees you." "Exactly." Relief flooded Ceres's expression. "You understand. Most people don't. They see the power, the status, the privilege of position, and assume loneliness is impossible. But being needed is not the same as being known. Being depended upon is not the same as being cared for. No one asks you about yourself," Daniel said, understanding clicking into place. "They ask about your decisions, your plans, your assessments. But never about whether you're okay, whether you're struggling, whether you need anything beyond efficient advisors and loyal subjects. Never, because a queen should not need. A queen should simply be strong, decisive, certain. Admitting vulnerability would be seen as weakness, as failure of leadership." Ceres's voice dropped. "So I stopped showing it, stopped even acknowledging it to myself, until I saw you standing in my receiving chamber, carrying the isolation in your bearing like a weight you'd grown accustomed to, and I recognized it because I carry the same weight." Daniel asked about her life before taking the throne. Seris explained that Valthari queens were chosen young, identified through genetic markers and potential readings that the species had used for millennia. She'd been selected at 15, taken from her family, trained for leadership in isolation from normal social bonds. "I was alone from the moment they chose me," she said. "Separated from my family to prevent favoritism, educated by tutors who saw me as future authority rather than as a child needing guidance. By the time I took the throne at 50, I'd already spent 35 years learning that everyone around me wanted something I could provide rather than wanting me." "How old are you now?" Daniel asked. 437 years old. I've been queen for 387 years, and in all that time I have not had a single conversation like this, where someone listened to my loneliness without trying to fix it, minimize it, or leverage it for their own purposes." Daniel shared his own story more fully, about Alina and Maya, about the life they'd been building on Haven Station, about the cascade of failures that had killed nearly everyone on the station, about the guilt of surviving when he hadn't been there to die with them, about the 5 years since, where he'd thrown himself into work because having purpose was easier than having grief. "People avoid asking about them," he admitted. "They see the pain it causes me and decide it's kinder to pretend the loss didn't happen. But that just makes me more alone, because I can't talk about the people who mattered most to me without making everyone uncomfortable." "I'm not uncomfortable," Sarah said gently. "Tell me about them. Who were they when they were alive, not just how you lost them?" So Daniel did. He talked about Alina's laugh, about how she challenged him intellectually and supported him emotionally, about Maya's endless curiosity, her questions about everything, her determination to understand how things worked, about the life they'd been building together before it was ripped away. Ceres listened with focused attention, asking questions that showed genuine interest rather than polite tolerance. She wanted to know what Alina had studied, what Maya had been interested in, what their daily life had looked like before the disaster. "You love them deeply," she observed. I do. The love doesn't stop just because they're gone. That's part of what makes it so hard. I can't stop loving them, can't stop missing them, can't stop feeling like part of me died with them. And now you're here, alone in alien space, representing a species you have no particular desire to advocate for, simply because circumstance made you the only option. Exactly. I came to this sector for survey work. It was supposed to be routine exploration. Then my entire task force died, and suddenly I'm the lone human in a first contact scenario I was never trained for. Daniel laughed without humor. I keep waiting for someone to realize how inadequate I am for this role and send someone better. But there is no one better to send because you're the only one here. Right. And so you continue, carrying responsibilities you never sought, representing billions you'll never meet, all while grieving losses you can't share with anyone who would understand. When you put it that way, it sounds very dramatic. It sounds very lonely, Seris corrected gently. Which brings me back to why I asked my question in the first place. I sensed in you someone who might not need anything from me except honest conversation. Was I wrong? Daniel considered that. No, Your Majesty, I don't need anything from you. Humanity sent me here because I'm the only option, not because I have political ambitions. If anything, I'm relieved to have a purpose again after months of just existing. He paused, then added, and honestly, it's strange to have someone ask a personal question. Most people avoid asking about my losses because it makes them uncomfortable. They'd rather pretend I'm fine than acknowledge that I'm not. I'm not uncomfortable with your pain, Seris said, and I don't need you to pretend you're fine. In fact, I find your honesty about not being fine deeply valuable. It's a courage most people lack, the courage to be genuinely seen rather than carefully managed. They talked until the guards shifted positions, a subtle signal that hours had passed and the Queen's schedule was being disrupted. Seris noticed and stood with obvious reluctance. I should let you return to your ship, she said. But Captain Reed, Daniel, if I may use your personal name, would you be willing to return? Not for diplomatic purposes, but simply to talk. Daniel stood as well, feeling an unexpected sense of loss at the conversation ending. If you want me to, yes. I have nowhere else I need to be, and honestly, this is the first conversation I've had in years where I felt like someone actually wanted to know what I thought rather than just what I could do for them. Then return in 3 days. We'll speak again without the weight of diplomacy or formal purpose. Just two people who understand what it means to be alone, choosing not to be alone together. I'd like that, Your Majesty. When we're alone like this, call me Seris. I want to hear my name spoken by someone who's using it to address me rather than to reference my position. Then I'll see you in 3 days, Seris. Her ears tilted forward in what Daniel was now certain was pleased attention. I look forward to it, Daniel. 3 days later, Daniel returned. The pattern established itself over the following weeks and months. Regular private meetings where he and Seris talked honestly about their lives, their losses, their perspectives on existence. The conversations were not romantic. Daniel was still grieving Alina and wasn't ready for anything beyond friendship. Seris was careful not to create any pressure or expectation beyond genuine connection. But what they built was profoundly important to both of them. Seris shared the weight of her decisions, the loneliness of making choices that affected billions, the exhaustion of being symbol rather than person, the difficulty of never being certain whether people's affection was genuine or just calculated response to her power. Daniel shared his ongoing process of grief, the good days and the terrible ones, his struggle to find meaning after loss, his gradual acceptance that moving forward didn't mean forgetting Alina and Maya. They discovered they helped each other in unexpected ways. Seris's isolation was different from Daniel's, but understanding his gave her framework for articulating her own. She'd spent centuries unable to name what she was feeling. Daniel's willingness to talk honestly about loneliness gave her language for her experience. Daniel's grief was different from Seris's loneliness, but understanding hers helped him recognize that isolation took many forms, and none of them were wrong to feel. Her acceptance of his continued love for his dead family, her encouragement to talk about Alina and Maya whenever he needed to, gave him something he'd been missing. Permission to grieve openly without performing recovery he didn't feel. Over months, their relationship became something neither had expected. Genuine friendship built on mutual understanding and respect for each other's honesty. The Valthari court noticed changes in their queen. She seemed less distant, more engaged, occasionally smiled in ways that suggested she was thinking about something pleasant rather than just managing state business. Her advisors were baffled but pleased. A queen who seemed less burdened was a queen who made clearer decisions. Human command was equally confused about why their lone representative seemed to have unusual access to the Valthari queen. Regular private meetings were noted in diplomatic reports. Questions were asked about whether Daniel was conducting negotiations without proper authorization. His response was simple and honest. "We're friends. We talk. That's all." No one quite believed that an alien queen and a human captain could be just friends. But diplomatic relations were improving steadily, so command decided not to question it too deeply. 6 months into their regular meetings, Seris asked Daniel something she'd been considering for weeks. "Do you remember when I first asked if you were alone, and you gave me your grief instead of just your tactical situation?" "Yes. I remember thinking I'd probably made a diplomatic error by being so honest." "You made the opposite of an error. You demonstrated something I'd been searching for without knowing how to ask for it." Seris settled into her usual seat in the private alcove where they met. "I've been thinking about why that moment mattered so much to me. And because emotional courage is rarer than physical courage. Standing alone in battle takes bravery, but standing alone in life and admitting it takes a different kind of strength." Seris's ears tilted in the expression Daniel now recognized as deep sincerity. "When you answered my question honestly, when you gave me your grief rather than just your tactical situation, you demonstrated that you value genuine connection more than comfortable pretense. That's what I'd been searching for. Someone who would choose vulnerability over performance. I wasn't trying to be courageous. I was just tired of lying about being fine. That's exactly what made it courageous. You were honest when dishonesty would have been easier, when you had nothing to gain from vulnerability except the possibility of being understood. That's the kind of courage that matters most to someone who lives surrounded by calculated responses and political performance." Daniel thought about that. "So asking if I was alone, that was you testing whether I'd be honest about something that made me vulnerable." "Yes. I needed to know if you were someone who could stand in your truth without performing strength you didn't feel. Because I desperately needed to talk with someone who wouldn't require me to perform strength I don't always feel either." Seris paused. "And you were. You answered honestly about your isolation, your grief, your losses. You didn't minimize your pain or pretend you'd recovered when you hadn't. That honesty gave me permission to be equally honest about my own loneliness. I've never thought of honesty about pain as courageous. It just seemed like the truth. Why would I lie about it? Because most people do lie about it. They perform recovery, strength, being fine when they're not fine. They hide their pain because vulnerability feels dangerous." Seris leaned forward. "But you didn't. You stood in your grief and your isolation and simply said, 'Yes, I'm alone, and here's what that means.' That's courage, Daniel. The courage to be seen as you actually are rather than as you wish you were." Daniel absorbed that, feeling something shift in how he understood their friendship. "You're alone too. Differently, but just as fundamentally. When I answered honestly about my isolation, it gave you hope that maybe you could talk about yours." "Exactly. I've been alone for centuries, unable to articulate it because doing so felt like admitting weakness. But watching you acknowledge your loneliness without shame, watching you talk about your grief without performing recovery, It showed me that honesty about pain isn't weakness. It's the foundation of genuine connection. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Finally, Daniel asked, "Do you still feel alone, now that we talk regularly?" "Less alone," Sarah said thoughtfully. "I'm still isolated by my position. That hasn't changed. But having someone who knows me as Ceres rather than just as queen, someone I can talk to honestly without performing certainty or strength I don't always feel, it makes the isolation more bearable." Does that make sense? Perfect sense. I'm still grieving Alina and Maya. I'm still alone in that my family is gone and nothing changes that. But having you to talk to, having someone who understands that isolation doesn't require fixing or minimizing, it makes the grief more manageable. "We're still alone, but we're alone together now," Saris observed. "That's not the same as not being alone, but it's better than being alone separately. Much better." A year into their friendship, Daniel faced a decision. Human Command was recalling him. A new task force was entering this sector, properly equipped for first contact and diplomatic relations. Daniel could either stay on as junior member of the diplomatic team or return to human space and resume normal duties. He told Saris about the choice during one of their regular meetings. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I don't know. Part of me wants to go back. Being here reminds me of how alone I am, how far from anything familiar. But part of me," he trailed off, "part of you doesn't want to leave because you've found something here that you can't find in human space," Saris finished. "Someone who understands your isolation without trying to fix it." "Yes, exactly that. I don't want you to leave," Saris admitted. "These conversations have become essential to how I survive my duties. Knowing I can talk to you, that you'll understand when I admit the weight is too heavy, it's the only thing that makes centuries of rule seem bearable. But I also can't ask you to sacrifice your connection to your own people just to provide me with companionship. It's not sacrifice, it's choosing what actually matters to me." Daniel met her eyes. "I could go back to human space and have proximity to other humans, but I wouldn't have what I have here. Genuine friendship with someone who understands loneliness without requiring me to perform recovery." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I want to stay. I'll join the diplomatic team as junior member if that's what's required, but I'm not leaving. Not when I've finally found someone who asks if I'm alone and actually wants to hear the honest answer." Saris's ears pressed fully forward in an expression Daniel had learned meant profound emotional response. "You're choosing to stay, even knowing your isolation here will continue." "I'm choosing to stay because my isolation is more bearable when shared with someone who understands it. You asked me if I was alone, and the answer was yes. But it's less true now than it was when you first asked. Because of you." They built years of friendship from that foundation. Daniel remained in Valthari space, serving on the diplomatic team but maintaining his private friendship with Ceres. Their regular conversations became the anchor both of them needed, a place to be honest about struggle, to acknowledge pain without shame, to simply exist without performing strength or certainty. The Valthari court eventually accepted that their queen had formed an unusual friendship with a human. The human diplomatic team accepted that Daniel had unique access that made him valuable despite his junior status. And Daniel and Ceres accepted that their connection was rare and valuable enough to maintain despite the complications it created. 5 years after Ceres first asked if Daniel was alone, they sat in their usual alcove, and she brought up that initial conversation again. "Do you remember what you told me when I first asked if you were alone? You said you were alone before your task force was destroyed, that you'd been alone since losing your family. You gave me your grief instead of just tactical information. I remember. It felt risky at the time, admitting vulnerability to an alien queen I just met. It was the bravest thing anyone has done in my presence in centuries," Sarah said seriously. "Not because the admission itself was dramatic, but because you chose honesty over safety. You could have given me a diplomatic answer, could have minimized your pain, could have performed strength. But you didn't. You stood in your truth and trusted me to handle it. You asked the question like you actually wanted to know the answer. Most people ask, "How are you?" without wanting honest response. You asked, "Are you alone?" And I could tell you meant it. I did mean it. I needed to know if you were someone who could be honest about pain, because I desperately needed someone I could be honest with about my own. Seris's expression held the vulnerability that had become comfortable between them over years of friendship. You answered honestly, and it changed everything for me. For the first time in centuries, I had someone who understood what isolation meant and didn't require me to pretend I wasn't lonely. You changed everything for me too, Daniel admitted. You asked if I was alone, and when I said yes, you didn't try to fix it. You didn't tell me I'd feel better eventually, didn't minimize the loss, didn't offer empty comfort. You just understood, and that understanding mattered more than any attempt to make me feel better could have. We're still alone in many ways, Seris observed. You're still the only human in this sector for significant stretches. I'm still isolated by my position and power, but we're not alone in our aloneness anymore, if that makes sense. Perfect sense. We're alone together, which is better than being alone separately. They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes from years of honest conversation and mutual understanding. Finally, Daniel spoke what he'd been thinking for months. "Thank you for asking if I was alone. Thank you for wanting the real answer instead of the comfortable one. Thank you for seeing my grief and not requiring me to perform recovery I hadn't achieved. Thank you for answering honestly. Thank you for showing me that emotional courage exists and matters. Thank you for being willing to see my loneliness without trying to solve it." Seris's ears tilted in the expression that meant deep affection. "And thank you for choosing to stay, even when leaving would have been easier. You gave me something I'd stopped hoping for, a friend who knows me as Seris rather than just as Queen. You gave me something equally valuable. Someone who understands that being alone doesn't require fixing, just acknowledging. Someone who asks, 'Are you alone?' and genuinely wants to hear the answer." Years continued. Daniel aged in ways Seris didn't, his hair graying, his face lining with time that barely touched her centuries-long lifespan. But their friendship remained constant. Two beings from different worlds who'd found connection through honest acknowledgment of isolation. When Daniel eventually developed health issues that required him to return to human space for treatment, Seris made sure he had the best medical care available from both species. When he recovered and asked if he could return to